and want to get a sense of how many of you are using evidence-based practice or are moving in that direction. While we're tallying those results and we look at the questions that have come from our audience, we have a lot of interest out there in risk assessment tools. And I was hoping that our panelists could speak to us about how we're doing in the pretrial services field across the board with the use of validated risk assessment tools.
Kenny, would it be appropriate to talk for a minute about the meeting that you and I attended yesterday on the subject of risk assessment?
Yeah, I think it would be.
Would you do us the honors?
Sure. The Bureau of Justice Assistance, along with PJI and the National Institute of Justice, hosted a meeting earlier this week to look at the science behind pretrial risk assessment. We brought to a table some of the leading experts on the risk assessment field, and for some reason they invited me too. And one of the things that came out of that, one of the big things that came out of that, was the fact that we are much, much further into validation and figuring out what factors are associated to failure, failure to appear, failure to remain arrest-free while on pretrial supervision than at any point in the existence of pretrial programs. The second thing that came very clear is that we still have a long, long way to go. There are risk factors that seem to be very common. When you do a risk validation, you seem to get maybe 8 or 9 variables that keep popping up to varying degrees. The question has become whether or not we can use these kinds of variables to almost give programs out there nationwide a universal screener of sorts, and there was a very good discussion on that. The bottom line when it comes to risk assessment, validation, and risk tools is that even those defendants who are showing up as high-risk defendants on these risk assessment tools really are not failing at a particularly high rate. I think we mentioned that for most of these assessment screeners, a high-risk defendant, that population, will still come to court and still remain arrest-free about 70 or 80% of the time. So the danger with doing risk assessment, as great as they are and as wonderful as they are, and as much as they beat the alternatives out there, is over-conditioning or over-applying supervision to a group who may not need that level of supervision. But it is something that we have to encourage programs to do, being able to practically identify defendants who should be released with no conditions at all from us, identifying those defendants who need a higher level of supervision, and then managing the middle population is probably the most important thing that's out there right now. And it's good that we have much more science behind us now than we had even 10 years ago.
Yeah, the conversation yesterday that Kenny describes was fascinating on a number of levels for me. Like Kenny, I was gratified to see that the science involved in laying out probabilities of risk associated with failing to appear and committing a new offense while under supervision, stands on its own as solid science. Selling that science turns out to be another job altogether, and one that comes with its own unique set of challenges. I think we're going to have to learn more about the DNA associated with decision making, with the perceptions of decision makers, and as Barb would remind us, to make sure decision makers get fed a constant loop of information regarding the decisions they're currently making. Because without that loop, validated risk schemes and other evidence-based practice really just kind of dissipates into the ether for these individuals. We have the obligation and the responsibility to inform decision makers how they're doing and to offer them the opportunities to improve those outcomes so we can have safer communities and more just systems. And Ellen, we're going to leave Dan off the hook on this one.
I had a great response.
Tessa, who did Dan's statewide risk assessment, was one of our panelists yesterday. And we're all very excited about the work that Ohio is doing, and we look forward to seeing some wonderful results. But if we may, can we turn to you and ask for any questions that have come in from the audience?
Well, we're not going to let Dan off the hook so easily. There seems to be a strong Ohio contingent out there listening to us this afternoon. We do have a follow-up question, though, that stays on the topic of risk assessment. One audience member would like to know if there's an approved and recommended risk assessment tool that any of you have experience with that you would recommend for this population as we move toward evidence-based practice.
This is Dan. I would think that one of the most exciting things that both Kenny and Tim were speaking to is that some of us old-timers in the field were originally taught that that your validated risk instrument had to be localized, and that alone had a number of agencies feel that they couldn't muster that ability to be able to support validation because of their data systems and that. I think as we've now gone to these larger state-validated system, and Marie von Ostrom's work in Virginia obviously was the first in this regard, and then Ed Latessa and Chris Lowenkamp in Ohio, and now we've had also the merger at the federal system where Marie von Ostrom and Chris Lowenkamp there are coming up with validated risk instruments that seem to be able to be validated, removing that localized issue. It still works at those individual local levels, but now you have the resources of a state or a federal system. And both Kenny and Tim alluded to, there seems to be some commonality in the risk questions that are coming out. I think this is an evolving field. I think for any agency out there, if you look at the Virginia model, and it's in its second generation right now, you'll see a lot of the risk the instruments that seem to be validated across these systems, whether it's the federal, the Virginia model, or the Ohio. Obviously, the University of Cincinnati's development of the pretrial risk instrument in Ohio, the 8 questions that we are currently piloting and using in Ohio, many of those questions, not all, but most of them mirror what you're seeing in those other ones. So I think the field is really done leaps and bounds in the last 5 years, and for some of us like Tim and Kenny and I that have been here for a long time, it's really thrilling to see these academics of the status of these individuals getting involved.
Yeah. And just for the record, this is Tim, everyone. I have not been around nearly as long as either Dan or Kenny. He just mentions me as being part of that group of old guys out of courtesy and respect, not out of my actual chronological age. I think to answer the caller's question, you have any number of recently validated risk schemes that appear very similar with each other from which to choose. This is, in fact, emerging science, as has been mentioned by all 3 of us. So the challenge doesn't turn out to be associated with finding one. The challenge turns out to be, in my opinion, more connected with understanding how it was constructed and what it means, what your expectations are of that risk assessment scheme, and how you use it at a local level, how your local stakeholders respond and use it to fulfill their mandates. If you have $1 million risk scheme and you put it in the hands of pretrial practitioners who are then told, use your subjective judgment, of course I would suggest that might significantly diminish the efficacy of the risk assessment if I'm having a bad day and I subjectively override the risk classification. I think that knowing how to use these new instruments correctly is of paramount importance. And as Kenny and I have heard, and Dan has experienced in Ohio, probably of more importance than which particular version you use as a starting point as you craft local validation of the risk elements that seem to be emerging consistently among the more visible of these risk assessment schemes.
true. And this is Kenny. Perhaps I'm anticipating or reading a little too much into the question, but I know that there are some popular assessment tools out there, not only that are being used by pretrial programs, but by other criminal justice agencies. For example, the LSIR, I think that's the Life Skills Inventory or Life Services Inventory, is a popular one. The full-blown version of the Addiction Severity Index has been used as an assessment tool, not only by pretrial programs, but by some probation agencies. And these tools, again, are better than nothing, but they start with the assumption that the person is already on supervision, and I don't think they address the central question at the pretrial stage of whether or not supervision is needed, period. The LSIR especially is really geared towards determining what kind of supervision services and what level of supervision, but the decision about supervision has already been made. Again, they're better than nothing, but I think we are evolving, as both Tim and Dan said, better routines and better instruments specific to pretrial populations that should be available to the field pretty soon.
Ellen, back to you.
Shifting over to outcome measures, our audience is very interested in knowing what kind of outcome measures should be used to determine the effectiveness of a pretrial release program.
Dan, do you want to take that one first for us?
Sure, and then my able friend Kenny can jump in, and this would really be a great time to have Barb on the line. You know, we as a field are looking at this currently. There are systems like Kenny's in Washington and New York City and even Barb's in Rochester that gather many data elements. And knowing that can sometimes impede smaller agencies, especially in these budget times, we as a field are trying to get to what are, say, 7 or 8 elements that you should be collecting as a bare minimum. And I think you're going to see further developments of this very recently in some of the committees that Kenny and I serve on. I think it's a goal that many of us want to see come out in the next year. But those obviously are how many individuals are you interviewing, what percentage of your overall individuals being booked into your county jail does that represent? You don't just want to count those you interview and not count the ones that aren't being interviewed because of our standard goal that we should be interviewing all of the individuals, defendants that are booked into our jails. What is our recommendation? Use of the validated risk instrument as far as what is the risk level and then what is our recommendation based upon that. What was our supervision recommendations regarding that? Of course, was that recommendation implemented? Was it accepted and implemented? So those are at the very beginning of the process, the elements you need to capture. The outcome measures of the individuals that are placed under your program are obviously, did they remain under your supervision throughout their pretrial judicial experience? If not, what were the reasons for negative outcomes? Were those failure to appear, program noncompliance, those type of issues need to be captured. And of course, then what was the final outcome of that supervision? As we know, we perform our job often and the individual ends up going to imprisonment. But we need to make sure we capture what our responsibility was regarding the individual's appearance at court, and was there any rearrest during that supervision or that pretrial experience? Those are, I think, are the basics. Kenny, wouldn't you agree that we're trying to get to as a base principle?
Yeah, definitely. Here at DC Pretrial Services, we've been in the performance and outcome measurement business since about 2000. And the one thing that we have developed, and we still are at it because you never achieve perfection in this, is a separate list of outcome measures, the things that are really tied to the mission and goals of your agency, and performance measures, the things that you want to make sure that you achieve daily, to make sure that you are on track with your mission and goals. Over the years, most pretrial programs have pretty much adopted failure to appear and rearrest as their two main outcome measures. How often do we keep people from missing court appearances? How good are we at keeping those persons in the community arrest-free while they're under supervision? And certainly they are important. I think one of the challenges that we'll have is figuring out whether or not there are other outcomes out there worth mentioning and measuring. The one that we are adopting in the next fiscal year here in D.C. are how many people who are released to our supervision are successful, how many stay in the community without being violated, without failing on pretrial supervision, to show how effective we can be as an alternative to jail. The one thing, though, that I would really caution in doing performance measures is there's a difference between measuring performance and just counting numbers. A lot of the performance measures that I've seen instituted by some agencies are simply the amount of work that you do. And there's a huge difference in telling me or telling your funders that I interviewed 10,000 defendants last year. That's a great number to throw out during budget times. But if there were 20,000 defendants who should have been interviewed and you only got 10,000, you're not being very efficient with what you're doing as a program. The efficiency measures are the most important performance measures to put out there. And when you're developing these measures, you have to think in terms of efficiency. How well am I accomplishing something? How often do I respond to defendants who violate conditions of supervision? How often do I identify people with substance abuse and mental health services needs and tie those people to the services that they have to have while on pretrial supervision? If you think about performance as the efficiencies, I think you go a much longer way of putting together data that will tell a better story about your agency, and also hopefully will help you in developing those partnerships that you need, both within the criminal justice system and outside.
So for those of you who are listening who really haven't done much yet with putting together some kind of outcome or performance measures, I can well imagine, as I know Dan and Kenny do, that your head's about to explode as you're trying to think about what are the right outcomes and what are the right measures. I think both of their remarks are germane to the challenge before you. First and foremost, you cannot conduct business that's publicly funded to benefit the public without some kind of public accounting of how well you're doing. Nor can you ever expect to get better at it unless and until you know the outcomes associated with your work and the public investment to support your work. As has been mentioned by our panelists, traditionally those outcomes have focused on the primary functions of bail, and that's an altogether appropriate thing. It's well and good, if not necessary, to track failure to appear information and rearrest while on release information. Those of us in the field would ask, however, that as you start to track those data, you invert them. You're talking, instead of failure to appear rates, you're talking about appearance rates. You don't have a 9% FTA rate, you have a 91% appearance rate. You have a 96% compliance or law-abiding rate. And I think as a matter of policy and as a matter of administration, for those of you out there responsible for programs, you need to seriously give thought to presenting your outcomes in a positive light rather than focusing in on the relatively small numbers of failures associated with your work. But this work that's a lot more complex and a lot more challenging though they may be, than simply tracking appearance and compliance rates. As Kenny and Dan have both mentioned, there's an array of outcomes associated with your work that you should be able to report on a routine basis and absolutely be able to report when asked. The National Institute of Corrections, the National Association of Pretrial Services Agencies, and the Pretrial Justice Institute, with support from BJA, are all ready to help you put together these outcomes PJI is working with the National Institute of Corrections Pretrial Network to put together a standardized starting point for programs in hopes of collecting outcome measures that would be consistent from coast to coast. Please stay tuned to our website and to the National Institute of Corrections and NAPSA websites as that work evolves and as we make it available to practitioners nationally. Ellen, back to you, please.
Please tell us how we might encourage bondsmen to better disclose system reports, failures to appear, and audit results.
I will start with that one, if I may. At PJI, I think we're probably as involved as any organization in addressing some of the friction and conflict between the bonding for profit industry and publicly funded programs that help courts make informed and safe decisions based on outcomes rather than based on profit. I would candidly suggest that it's going to be next to impossible to get bondsmen interested in more accountable policies and procedures. I have never seen a jurisdiction that routinely publishes outcomes of bonding for profit that are system-wide accruals of appearance rates or compliance rates. And to ask the individual practitioner or the individual profit maker, they will tell you, I think, and have gone on record as saying, my outcome is my profit. And that's how I know how well I'm doing, whether or not I'm in business. And for someone associated with private enterprise and one that is profit-driven, that answer is the same whether I run a gas station or a pharmacy or a bail bonding company. Those at the public sector are not involved in profit-taking, nor are they motivated by profit, and as a result are held accountable to different standards. I would suggest to the listener who asked the question, however, that it is the responsibility of a regulatory agency. In many states, that agency is somewhere in the insurance administrator's office. In some states, this regulatory responsibility lies with the clerk of the court, but in virtually every state and territory of the Union, there is regulatory authority vested in a public agency responsible for the management and regulation of bonding for profit. We are now seeing almost on a weekly basis media coverage. I think a lot of it started by the National Public Radio coverage 6 or 7 months ago that has really started an avalanche of coverage that has literally gone coast to coast, that has exposed that the regulatory management of the bonding for profit industry leaves a lot to be desired. To bring that management up to snuff, I would suggest approaching the regulatory agency responsible for that management, and I would also suggest going to the media, because the media has been responsible for making many social changes in this nation over its history, and I think they have the opportunity to help bring accountability, honesty, and transparency to bonding for profit as well. Those three elements cannot be rejected by the bonding for profit industry as inappropriate. Those three elements are what we demand of any industry that serves the public. They're in the unique position of serving the public and bearing the responsibility for public safety and the orderly administration of justice. If they are to be tolerated in our nation's justice systems, they must, in fact, be held accountable. Gentlemen, other thoughts?
I'll start if Dan is okay with that. I come from a jurisdiction here in Washington where money bond is virtually non-existent. Usually if a bond is set here locally, it's tied to the fact that you're serving a sentence or there's something else holding you in jail. And I agree with Tim that most bonding agents are going to tell you flat out, I don't have that responsibility to report and I'm not going to do it unless there's a regulatory agency that really forces their hand. From what I've been familiar with across the country, it has been the media that has taken the forefront, usually in reporting abuses by the commercial surety bail agencies that have led to those regulatory agencies wanting to take action, usually wanting to go after the bond forfeitures that seem to be so routinely forgiven across the country. The other thing is, and I say this to pretrial programs with the capacity to do it, and I guess the guts to do it, not only do you have to measure what you do, you can feel totally free if you have the ability to track financial bail to show the court what bondsmen are doing. If you can identify commercial surety bail in your release population and track their rates of failure just as you track your rates of failure, there's no law against reporting that out. And if you can do that, and if you can show that there's a stark difference and the use of money is more of a hindrance than it is a help, I suggest taking that course of action.
This is Dan. I would obviously in total agreement with both what Tim and Kenny had to say, and I would just add that besides the state regulatory agencies, every jurisdiction has their own culture to a degree on how they handle surety bonds and bond forfeitures. Your clerk's office should be responsible for some reporting on that. Sometimes just a basic question asking your clerk's office whether they report on a regular basis or can report on number of bonds that have gone to capias. Secondly, have gone on to forfeiture. Which of those total numbers and what percentage of the totals those represents were actually paid in full, reduced, or excused. Sometimes really gives you some information that's very unique, because the surety industry's position as profit-driven, as Tim related, is basically that if they don't perform, they have to forfeit the bond, they have to put the money up, and so that forces them to perform. But when you look at your local jurisdictions and look at how those things happen, you may be surprised that their actual financial exposure is very limited.
Ladies and gentlemen, as your moderator, I'm provided with a